In this video, I'm going to make keys to a 2009 Ford Ranger, and I'm going to use the 8-cut Tryout keys. Now, I could use the leashy. It's quick, easy, and fast. The leashy is the new way of doing it, but this is just to show you the old way of doing it and why the Tryout keys, you have to know what's in your door lock, what's in your ignition, and then the Tryout keys are actually super easy. And this went really fast. Sometimes it's the last key, sometimes it's the first couple. But again, the video here is to show you how to use Tryout keys, and we go from the start all the way through the finish, making keys to the door lock, and then we'll make keys to the ignition, and then we'll program the key in. Here's why I like Tryout keys. When all our other methods fail, you usually pull out a set of Tryout keys and you try the keys and see if you can get the lock to turn. So it's a great backup, and sometimes on some cars it's just the easiest way to go to, is just pull out a set of Tryout keys. The Tryout keys work on the imperfections of the lock. So you can have, and they're called half cuts. So you can have, let's take, you have a 1 wafer and a 3 wafer. If you cut it to a 2, sometimes it'll work both wafers. Or to get a 1 and a 2, sometimes you'll cut it to a 1.5, so it works the 1 wafer and it also works the 2. So you can have these half cuts. And a lot of code machines will allow you to either program in or the half cuts, or you can physically do it when you're using a manual code machine. So let's talk about Fords. Ford, you hear me talking a lot about, we break Fords down to the early versions were the single-sided 5-cut, but it's single-sided 5-cut. And that went, they sort of phased that out around 1967. However, you can still see them in 68s. You can still see them in truck bodies and all sorts of things. So we have the 5-cut, single-sided Fords. The next key that Ford used, they went to a 5-cut double-sided key. So they called it a convenience key. No matter how you put the key in, it would work both ways. So that was called a convenience key, and that's a 5-cut. And it came in 2 different keyways. It came in the ignition, and it also came in the door and trunk key. So you would have, so there's 2 keys that would fit most of the older Fords between about 1968 till 1980, but we still see them in trunk bodies. For the Fords is interesting. The Tryout keys work on the imperfections of the lock. So you could make, instead of having 1,200 keys on the code series and trying 1,200 keys, you can break it down to 50 or a couple hundred keys, and then you can try the keys out. The most important thing is always look up the year, make, and model of the car you're working on. And you can do that through online books, you can do it through the physical books, but always look up year, make, and model and realize one thing. Sometimes it can bleed over, like let's say it says in 1968, it's a 5-cut Ford. You could run across a 68 that could be something different or an older one. So always check year, make, and model, and be aware that sometimes it could be a year earlier or a year later than what you're looking at. And now we come to the Ford 8-cut Tryout keys. This is a huge set. Oh my goodness, but Tryout keys. The Tryout keys aren't really meant for something oddball like some of the Mustangs and some of the Ford Expeditions and other cars and trucks. The 8-cut is really meant to work on the door lock, usually has wafers 1 to 6 in it, so, or whatever. You got to look it up, and you start with your first set. When you find a key that turns, then you have to figure out now the ignition. So we can use it as a fill program, or we just follow through our instructions that come with, with the different manufacturers. We will find the key that works the door, and then we will go to the next set. So you could start off on set number 1, and it says, oh, go to set number 7. and try these keys. And that's how you can, if you want to go through this way, again, we're talking old ways of doing things, the tryout keys. There's better ways of doing it nowadays, but when all else fails, we go back to sometimes the tryout keys. Sometimes you can just, once you figure out the door, then you can figure out the trunk, if you got the keys locked in the trunk. And then you can progress it from the door to the trunk, or the trunk to the door to the ignition. Usually everything's progressing towards making keys to the ignition. Look it up. There's 1 to 8 usually in the ignition. It could be whatever, depending on your make and model. But once we make a key to the door, then we can figure out the ignition. Nowadays, there's better tools. I'm showing you the tryout keys because this is how we started. When Fords first came out, we just bought the tryout keys, and it was the quick, easy way. Anything's quicker than pulling apart the door panel. 4 to 8 cuts, read the instructions, and make sure these sets are really meant for when the door has 1 to 6 in it. Tryout keys. This is interesting because the 8 cuts are about 1,200. If you want to cut every last key, I think it's 1,232 keys will cut you every Ford key. Or you have this set of tryout keys. Again, they're cut to half cuts. Interesting. And again, how it works on the imperfections of the lock. One of my favorite books always, I use Fast Facts, I use online programs, and I just like, this is an older book. It's the Michael Hyde's book, Auto Smart Domestic, and they have one for foreign. They have newer ones. I'll have to find out what it goes up to. So this is my reference manual, my go-to book to find out what am I dealing with. So I have a 2009 Ford Ranger. So in the book, and there's online, and this is just one of my favorite books. So I have a 2009 Ford Ranger. Making a first key, this is important. We'll go to 18 on the make the first key. The mechanical key, 875. This is the Stratec number, so we know we have a transponder chip, so we need that. That's the key I like. There's the dealer number. Well, Stratec and the dealer is the exact same key. And there's, if you use Ilco, Ilco's fine. Whatever works. I just have really good luck with the Stratecs. So if I want to leash it, we're doing tryout keys on this. This is what we're showing off is the tryout key. Now go to making the first key, and we're going to 18. So let's go to how to make a key, 18. So we know it's for the 8 cut. It's in our code series still. Now this is where the parts that I say is super important. We know the door is 1 to 6, and we know the ignition is 2 to 8. So what we have to do is figure out, we're lucky we don't have to figure out the first cut for the ignition, but the door we have to, 1 to 6 on the doors, 2 to 8. There's no tailgate locks on this. I don't think there's a glove box lock. We're not using the leashy because the part of this training thing is to show you how to use the tryout keys. If we want to do the progression to figure out 7 and 8, technically we could use 5 different keys and we try all these numbers to make the key. But that's a separate video. That's how we progress to find the last 2 numbers, but you're going to use 5 keys. Because we're using the tryout set, we're just going to use the tryout key and find out which one works. So I'm going to use the Ford 8-cut tryout keys, and we know the door lock has 1 to 6 in it, and we're going to find the set to find the keys. So this is the 8-cut Ford tryout sets. I always wear gloves, easier on the fingers. So I tried my first key. This is the 1, 2. And you just sort of give it a little bit of a jiggle. Go to the next set. So there we do. We have a key that works. And we lucked out. This is like the first couple. So we know this is the 5-6 key. So we know that's a 5. Now we look it up in the book, and we find the matching keys to try the ignition. Let's just try this in the ignition. You never know. Sometimes it works right off the bat in the ignition. Sometimes it works in the ignition. We're not so lucky today. So let me now, this is a 5-6. The tryout key is 5-6. It's a 5 is the working. So let's just look up what keys to grab, and we'll try those other keys in the ignition now. So the book said use the 5 key first. We know that doesn't work. Then use the 171, 172. Oh shoot, that's so lucky. So it's the 172 key. We'll turn the ignition, we'll cut it and see what we do. Turn the key machine on, the ITL. It says move to the right, move to the left. That self-adjusts. Going to put the key in here. Going to punch the code in, the manufacturer. And the key I'm going to punch in is 2, 4, 4, 2, 4, 2, 1, 2. Code cut. Four, 2, 4, 2, 1, 2. Code cut. Now, if you've noticed here, I put the key in, and it's binding. You see an impressioning mark. The first wafer is binding, and if we flip it over, the second is binding. We cut this as a 244, 24212. Because it's binding on the first and second cut, I'm going to recut this as a 3-5, and then just leave the rest the same. So it's going to be a 3-5, and then it should work perfectly in the door, and then we'll try the ignition. We tested it in the doors, cut it down, we cut it to code, and what do we got? Now, this is still only a mechanical key. The key works. You got to be careful on some cars. If you try to start it, you could put in the anti-theft. Some Fords. So we know this mechanical key is perfect now. It works. Now I'll cut the mechanical key on a transponder key, and then I'll make sure the transponder key works, and then I'll program it into the car. That'll be in other videos. So right now, we did the 8-cut Tryout key set. Door was 1 to 6. And then we saw the impressioning marks or the binding marks on the key. We cut those down and we got it right to the perfect mechanical key. So it's not really that complicated. Use your Tryout keys. This is an older method of doing it. There's easier and better methods now, but sometimes when all else fails, we go back to the Tryout keys. I like to cut the key to factory original, and I like to give the key code to the customer after I finish the job. So because I want to figure the code out, I'm actually going to go to Fill Online, and it's a Ford. Even though I know my cuts now, I want to reverse it back to the code. And I know I'm dealing with an 8-cut. I'll sign in. So I've signed in. Let's pretend we didn't know what the last 2 cuts are. But I figured out 1 to 6 from the door. So I have 3, 5, 4, 2, 4, 2. Let's just say that's what I got. And I don't know the last 2. I did 1 to 6 in the door. So right there, 354, 424, 212, and the code is 0055X. So this is what I like to give the customer. I want to give them the code 005X. Sometimes I'll write down the cuts as well, but I always give them the code, so if they ever lose the key, and you'd be amazed how many customers call us back, they have the code, so it saves them money, saves us time, cut the key by code and program in the transponder. And sometimes we'll do a screenshot of this and email it to them, or let them take a screenshot, take a picture of this, and then the customer has it as well. So it's just a nice little perk to look after your customers. In conclusion, it's a Ford Ranger, 2009 Ford Ranger. We're doing Tryout keys. The book told us in the door lock was positions 1 to 6, and the ignition was actually 2 to 8. When we did the Tryout keys, the 5 Tryout key worked at the door. So the 5-6 Tryout key worked, and it's a 5. And then we looked up on the book. It said, go to these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys. That didn't work. That didn't work. This is the key that worked the ignition, the 172. So I cut that. Basically, I put in, because we know the 5 key, I put a 2 in here. So I cut the 172 key, 24424212. Tried it in the door, and position 1 had a binding mark or an impressioning mark, and position 2 had a binding mark. So that means then I came down to here. So I come down here and I cut it as a 35424212. It worked the door perfect. It worked the ignition perfect. And I cut a mechanical key. Now, to make a key for the car, I will cut it on a transponder, check in the door, check in the ignition, and then program it. Also, now that I know that this was the proper key, I went to lock codes and I punched in the codes. So the code is a 0055X, and that's the code I give the customers. And sometimes I'll even write that code down so they can do a screenshot, put it on the back of my business card. I don't put 2009 Ford Ranger. What I'll do is I'll put the code and maybe the cut sometimes. It just depends upon the customer and the security, whatever. But you still have to have a code machine. Cut all this. It's still a transponder key, so this may open up the doors. It's not going to start the car till we program it. So this is a bit of how we did everything, step by step. Stay tuned for more videos.